It began as a dawn like any other, the quiet, invisible turn of the planet beneath our feet, that eternal rhythm we had never questioned. No prophet, no physicist, no farmer rising before sunrise had ever doubted it. The earth turned, always had, always would. The morning followed the night, the tides obeyed the moon, the winds circled the oceans, a cosmic heartbeat, steady and ancient. But what if that pulse missed a beat? What if, for the first time in 4.5 billion years, the Earth, our cradle and gyroscope, simply stopped spinning? No explosion, no warning. One instant of impossible stillness, and in that instant, the entire world began to die. The moment of stoppage would have been almost indescribable, not because it was slow, but because it was too fast for language to contain. At the equator, the surface of the planet moves at more than 1,600 kilometers per hour. Every object, every ocean, every grain of sand, every body clinging to the crust is part of that movement. So when the Earth halted, if only by divine cruelty or cosmic accident, everything not fused into bedrock would have kept moving at that same velocity. Cities became avalanches of glass and steel. Oceans rose like walls, scouring continents bare. The atmosphere itself, suddenly unmoored, roared eastward in a storm that would have stripped the flesh from bone. It was the single most violent second in planetary history, a second that turned skyscrapers into bullets and clouds into weapons. And then, silence. When the survivors, if that word can even be applied, crawled from the ruins, they found themselves in a world without motion, without balance, without dawn or dusk. The Earth, once a graceful dancer, had turned into a corpse suspended in space. Half the planet now faced the sun eternally, baking under a merciless, unmoving day. The other half plunged into endless night, frozen beneath constellations that no longer wheeled across the sky. The great equatorial winds had died, the seasons had died, even the concept of time had lost meaning. The age of rotation was over, the age of stillness had begun. At first, there was disbelief. Governments, what remained of them, spoke of temporary axial instability. Scientists whispered words like angular momentum failure, gravitational anomaly, cosmic friction. But such words meant nothing anymore. The language of physics had no grammar for miracle or doom. Reports, if they could still be called that, spoke of oceans fleeing toward the poles, drawn by centrifugal memory. The equatorial regions were stripped bare, their seas turned to wandering walls of vapor. Across the continents, new mountain ranges of frozen water rose where the tides had crashed and congealed. The map of the world redrew itself in a week. Humanity had always believed itself the master of adaptation. We survived ice ages, plagues, empires. But this was something older than any god we had ever named. The planet itself had betrayed us, or perhaps simply reminded us that we were never its rulers, only its passengers. On the day the world stopped, the concept of nation dissolved. No flag could command the winds that no longer blew. The old capitals were gone. London swallowed by the sea, Delhi buried under desert dust, New York shattered against its own horizon. Only a few highland regions, the Andes, the Himalayas, and the Ethiopian plateau, survived the first cataclysm. From those mountain fortresses, scattered communities began the grim arithmetic of survival. They had water, thin air, and above all, shade. Shade, the new gold of a motionless world. I have read what little remains of their early journals. Day 1, wrote a teacher in Cusco, the sun rose and did not set. We took turns standing in its light to believe it was real. By noon, the crops were dying. By evening, which no longer came, the children began to scream for darkness. On the far side of the planet, in the eternal night, another survivor recorded, We hear the ice cracking in the valleys. The stars do not move. I would trade every god in heaven for one sunrise. That was how humanity was divided, between those burned alive by the ending day and those frozen to statues in the infinite night. The first global migration was unlike any in history, not by choice, not by war or greed, but by thermodynamics. The only habitable zone left was the narrow band between day and night, the Terminator, that twilight frontier where dusk met dawn and the temperatures, for a few fleeting degrees of latitude, were survivable. There, in the strip of perpetual evening, refugees from both worlds met, the burned and the frozen, united by terror. The Twilight Belt, as later chronicles called it, stretched like a silver wound around the planet. It became the last stage for the human story. In the first months, survival was not science but instinct. Crops failed under unchanging light. Animals perished in confusion. The atmosphere, no longer stirred by rotation, thickened into deadly stagnation. The air on the dayside grew heavier, compressed by relentless heat. On the night side, it thinned to near vacuum. Winds howled between the two, scouring the Terminator with sand and ice. Still, people built. They carved shelters into cliffs, covered them with mirrors to reflect the worst of the sun, or with dark stones to absorb its warmth. They called these new settlements stations of balance. Some even found strange beauty in their predicament. Artists painted the eternal horizon, a band of gold suspended between death by fire and death by frost. But beneath that fragile culture lay despair. For though humanity had survived, the planet's very heart had stopped beating. Scientists, those who remained, tried to measure, to calculate, to reason. They discovered that without rotation, the planet's magnetic field was collapsing. The sky began to shimmer with ghostly auroras, not of wonder, but of decay. Cosmic radiation poured through the thinning shield, corrupting DNA, igniting cancers, mutating crops. The very sunlight, once the giver of life, became poison. And yet, as always, we adapted. We dug deeper into the earth. We built mirrored cities at the edge of shadow. We learned to trade ice for grain, darkness for light, breath for heat. Humanity became a species of the border, half phoenix, half worm. In the archives of the station's Solace, I once found a child's letter written to no one. The sky never moves. I asked Mama if it's dead. She said no, it's just resting. I think she's lying. The words are simple, but they capture everything the philosophers of that age tried to express in 1,000 pages. The death of movement was not only physical, it was spiritual. Civilization had always been defined by motion, of trade, of ideas, of time itself. When the earth stopped turning, so did the rhythm of meaning. Days became indistinguishable. History itself froze. Still, in the silence, there remained a question, whispered by every survivor, written in every crumbling book, prayed over every child's grave. Was this the end of history, or merely the pause before a new kind of dawn? For if the earth had stopped once, perhaps, just perhaps, it could begin again. In the first years after the stoppage, the Twilight Belt was less a place than a wound, a raw seam where the planet's two halves scraped against each other. It was a corridor of survival only a few hundred kilometers wide, circling the entire globe like a halo of bruised light. There, dawn and dusk fused into a single, eternal evening. From orbit, had anyone still flown there, It would have looked like a thin ring of gray-blue between a blistered hemisphere and a frozen one. On the day side, oceans boiled off and continents cracked under deserts of glass. On the night side, glaciers crawled outward, slow and irresistible, like fingers of a dead god. And in between, on that fragile band, humans began to negotiate with the end of the world. The first societies that took root along the Twilight frontier were, by necessity, hybrids. They consisted of two tribes that had once been one species, the Burned and the Frozen. Those who had fled the eternal day brought with them seeds, solar panels, now useless, and a fear of open sky. Those who crawled out of the endless night brought sleds, furs, and a reverence for any scrap of warmth. They mistrusted each other instinctively. The Sun folk saw the night refugees as feral and brutal, raised under auroras and famines. The night folk saw the sun survivors as arrogant technocrats who once believed air conditioning and stock markets could tame the universe. In the first decade, more people died in clashes at the border than from radiation. Local chronicles speak plainly of it. One anonymous record from a settlement in the shattered Alps reads, "We met those from the dark side at the river. They wanted our grain. We wanted their ice. We had rifles with a few cartridges left. They had blades and nothing to lose. For 3 days the water ran red. On the 4th we began to talk." Necessity, that old sculptor of civilization, eventually carved a truce. Economy returned long before politics. Even in a dead world, people still had something to trade. From the scorched side came hardy crops, engineered in the old age to withstand heat and drought, wheat that could root in sand, beans that fed on their own shadows. From the frozen valleys came ancient treasures newly reborn, ice, permafrost-preserved seeds, metals dug from glaciers, and, most valuable of all, stable cold. Cold, in the Twilight Age, was not merely temperature, it was infrastructure. In underground caverns on the nightward slopes, communities built vast ice vaults, crude, sprawling refrigerators carved into the bones of mountains. There they stored grain, dried meat, and whatever medicines had survived the stopping. The bankers of this new world were not financiers, but cold keepers, the custodians of frozen security. On the dayward slopes, by contrast, heat did the work. Black stones absorbed the slanting sunlight of the eternal evening, warming terraces where the last photosynthetic life clung on. Farmers became astronomers of the unmoving sky. They learned to measure angle and color rather than time. Harvest seasons were no longer months, but horizontal distances. A few kilometers closer to the day side meant scorching death. A few toward the night side meant frostbite. The Twilight Belt was not only a place, it was a gradient. To live was to navigate it. Markets inevitably appeared. Not stock exchanges with tickers and derivatives, but raw bazaars laid out along the narrow safe lines where the air was still breathable and the winds not yet murderous. I've always been struck by the resemblance between these early Twilight markets and the German cities of the early 1920s. In Weimar, Germany, wheelbarrows of useless nancoats bought a loaf of bread, value dissolved daily. Here, the currency itself was the most transient thing of all, temperature. One could pay for a barrel of ice with a sack of dried beans, only to find that by the time the beans were delivered, the ice had half melted, its value literally evaporating into thin air. Goods decayed as they moved, nothing was stable. As in Weimar, speculation flourished. Only now the speculators were not brokers, but line walkers. Men and women who moved caravans a little closer to day or to night, gambling that the balance between heat and cold would shift in their favor. They had no graphs, no models, only scars and instinct. By the time we reached the third ridge, recounts a trader's diary from the Andes Terminator, half my ice was gone, but the price had doubled. I thanked the sun with a curse. Value, once abstract and digital, had become brutally physical again. Water, calories, shade, and stable air pressure, these were the new gold standards. Power followed the same ancient script it always had. It flowed to those who controlled abundance in a time of scarcity. In some regions, the first rulers of the Twilight Age were former technocrats, engineers who understood the remnants of pre-stoppage infrastructure. They knew how to repair turbines to pump groundwater, how to align mirrors to redirect lethal light into life-saving warmth. Around these figures formed technocratic enclaves, half bunker, half monastery, where old knowledge was guarded like sacrament. In other regions, authority grew out of the barrel of a rifle, as it had so often before. Militias that had once been local self-defense groups hardened into proto-states. They took names like Sunward Guard or Order of the Shadow, wrapping their brute control in cosmic metaphor. As in the shattered Europe after the First World War, people longed for someone to impose order on the chaos, even at terrible cost. The Weimar-like flux of the early Twilight market made them receptive to anyone who promised fixed prices, fixed borders, fixed rules. "Discipline is survival," proclaimed one early Twilight chieftain in the Himalayas, engraving the motto above his fortress gate, and his people, exhausted by eternal evening and unpredictable storms, nodded in weary agreement. Religion, too, found new soil. For millennia, humans had worshipped the sun as a benevolent god, returning each morning, withdrawing each evening, a cyclical promise of renewal. Now, the sun was a tyrant, staring down without blinking, roasting half the planet into silence. In the eternal night, by contrast, the stars had once been symbols of distance and mystery. Now they were hideously present, the only constant companions of those condemned to the frozen side. Theologies shifted accordingly. On the dayward rim of the Twilight Belt rose cults of veiling, religious orders dedicated to covering, shading, dimming. Their rituals involved building layers of canopies, painting rocks white, reflecting light back into space, a liturgy of refusal against the cosmic glare. In their hymns, the holiest word was shade. On the nightward rim, by contrast, grew sects of kindling. They depicted themselves as keepers of the last flame against universal cold. Fire, once a mundane tool, became the central sacrament. To share a coal was to share salvation. And at the very center of the belt, where neither day nor night fully claimed the sky, arose a third current, a twilight mysticism that saw the stoppage not as punishment, but as revelation. History, wrote one of their early scribes, was always swinging between extremes, war and peace, empire and collapse, feast and famine. Now the planet itself has frozen us at the edge between opposites. Perhaps this is not the end, but the test. Can we live without oscillation? The question was profound. The answer, as the centuries would prove, was not encouraging. Politically, the Twilight Belt fragmented into three broad zones, although the boundaries were always porous and contested. Closest to the day side lay the sun marches, thin strips of land constantly on the verge of catastrophe. Here, agriculture was barely possible. Every year, as the atmosphere shifted and the new desert winds advanced, settlements had to retreat a little further into cooler latitudes. Life there resembled a permanent, grinding retreat, like an army falling back in slow motion ahead of an invading foe. In these marches, societies became harsh, mobile, suspicious of strangers. Their laws were simple: move or die, share or burn. Leadership tended to be martial, almost Spartan. The sunburned people of the marches looked down on the rest of the twilight as soft. On the far side lay the frost cantons, highlands perched above the encroaching glaciers. Here, the problem was not too much sun, but not enough. Every year, ice crawled closer and communities had to dig deeper to reach soil or rock. The frost cantons became expert miners, tunnelers, and archivists, hiding their treasures underground. They saw themselves as the last guardians of old Earth, both materially and spiritually. And in the middle band, like a frail bridge, lay the middle band, the heart of the Twilight Belt, where temperatures were bearable enough to sustain permanent townships, where small rivers still flowed, where the air did not cut or suffocate. It was in this middle band that something like civilization, in the old sense, tried to reconstitute itself. It began with roads. Not highways of asphalt, long since peeled up and scattered by the first cataclysm, but stony paths flagged carefully along isotherms, imaginary lines where the temperature, air pressure, and wind were just stable enough. Merchants, priests, mercenaries, scholars, they all followed these paths, walking the edge of survivability around the globe. The belt became a continuous, ragged caravanserai, each station a mirror of the last, a cluster of dwellings half buried in rock, a trade square with ice on one side and grain on the other, a shrine to either shade or flame, and a bulletin wall, the primitive press of the Twilight Age. On these walls, scribes posted decrees, trade rates, weather signs, and increasingly, stories. For in a world where the sun no longer moved and clocks had lost meaning, narrative itself became the last way to measure time. I have handled fragments of those early Twilight tales, written in charcoal on animal skins, etched into scrap metal, copied and recopied in monasteries of the middle band. They are full of war and famine, yes, but also of an obsessive wondering. What had the world been like before the stopping? It is here that history, as a discipline, slowly reawakened, not as a dry academic pursuit, but as a desperate act of self-definition. The first Twilight historians were not scholars in the old sense. They were survivors who realized that without a past, the belt would devour itself in repetition. They gathered stories from the burned and the frozen, tried to piece together maps from half-melted screens and crumpled atlases. They preserved on paper and stone what they could still salvage of the pre-stoppage age: the wars, the nations, the empires, the follies. One of them, a nameless chronicler from what had once been Central Europe, left behind a line that has haunted me all my life. We walk forever along the edge between fire and ice because our ancestors lived forever as if there were no edge at all. He understood what few of his contemporaries grasped: that the Twilight Age was not some random cosmic misfortune, but a mirror held up to centuries of human extremism. Before, we had swung between ideological poles, economic bubbles, imperial fantasies. Now the planet had forced us to inhabit the knife edge between two physical absolutes. It was as if history itself had hardened into geography. But that, as I have often reminded my students, belongs to the later chapters of this tale, to the age of fixed empires beneath a fixed sun. Here, in the early decades of stillness, the most important transformation was quieter, more intimate. Humanity, accustomed for millennia to a world where no moment repeated exactly, had to learn to live in a universe where the sky never changed. Some went mad, some became saints of patience. Most, as always, simply adapted without philosophy, scraping by in the narrow band between annihilation by heat and annihilation by cold. We had lost our spinning world, but we had not yet lost the habit of spinning stories around it. And it was that habit, more than any machine or army, that would determine whether the Twilight Belt became the cradle of a new civilization or merely the last trench of a dying one. In the centuries before the stoppage, humanity had mapped the world with obsessive precision. Borders, trade routes, currents, jet streams, time zones. We charted everything that moved. But after the Earth ceased to turn, movement itself became treason. Anything that slipped too far toward the day would burn. Anything that drifted toward the night would freeze. Geography no longer allowed nations to expand or retreat freely. Every meter mattered. And yet, against all sense, humans began to move again. Not because they wanted to, but because the Earth forced them to. The Twilight Belt, once a refuge, slowly transformed into a corridor of instability. The atmosphere, no longer governed by Coriolis forces, developed monstrous circulatory cells. Seasonal jet streams had vanished. In their place rose thermal trenches, colossal rivers of hot and cold air colliding along the Terminator. These trenches shifted unpredictably, sometimes by kilometers in a single week. When they moved, whole settlements were erased. A trading post might enjoy tolerable temperatures on Monday, then be struck by a freezing gale from the night side on Thursday. Or worse, a sudden blast of solar heat would liquefy the fortifications that had seemed secure the year before. Civilizations, still fragile, learned to live like nomads tethered to the immobile sky. Towns did not fall, they were abandoned. Cities did not rise, they crept. The Twilight Belt became a living creature, and nations became its passengers. The first great migration of the Twilight Age is known to historians as the Drift of the Sun Marches. It began with the most sunward settlements, those brave, desperate enclaves who had hoped to farm the last tatters of light without being consumed by it. But the sun crept closer. Not in distance, of course, but in effect. The atmosphere grew thinner at the subsolar point, allowing deadly radiation to seep outward. The once stable hot line moved toward the middle band. As it did, villages that had clung to the edge of the day found themselves cooking alive within months. A diary preserved in the archive of Koroa Ridge contains the last words of an entire settlement. The horizon brightened this week. The rocks are too warm to touch. The cistern boiled at noon. We move tomorrow, those who can. The children's shadows are shorter. The sun is walking towards us. Within 3 years, the sun marches collapsed like shrinking skin. Tens of thousands fled westward or eastward along the belt, avoiding the lethal day at their backs. They joined the middle band's trade trails, ragged lines of scorched, half-blind refugees carrying solar scars like tribal brands. The migration brought more mouths than grain, more fear than labor, more stories than truth. And where masses move, nations tremble. In the frost cantons, the opposite calamity unfolded. Glaciers advanced, not with the slow dignity of ancient ice ages, but with violent surges, cracking, popping, collapsing forward like collapsing fortresses. The night side, with its unending cold, built mountains of ice that grew like tumors. The cantons were forced upward into cliffs, downward into caverns, sideways into the middle band. Those who had lived for generations under the stars were pushed, unwillingly, toward the light. They brought with them their own terrors, stories of ice quakes, frozen plagues locked in the dark for millennia, creatures found in caverns that no one could classify. Historians still debate whether the moonless wolves mentioned in Cantonese oral fragments were real animals or metaphors for cold and hunger. I have seen drawings carved into bone, lean silhouettes with too many joints, too many eyes. Most scholars dismiss them as hallucinations born of starvation. But the frost cantons, like the sun marches, were emptied. Entire tribes poured into the middle band, carrying with them glacial stone tools, icy currencies, and their sacred flame jars, small containers of oil that symbolized life in the dark. When the burned met the frozen, the collision shaped the centuries. It was during this era of forced movement that the Twilight Belt saw its first attempts at unification, not political, but existential. Food, cold, territory, these were the classic pillars of conflict. But now a new element entered the arena: position. If a state drifted too far toward the day, it perished. If it drifted too far toward the night, it suffocated. Thus the race for the optimal band began, a narrow sliver within the belt where conditions were most stable. Whoever controlled this band would control the only viable farmland, the largest rivers, the safest air. Predictably, conflict erupted. The Twilight Wars were not wars in the old sense. There were no fronts, no battlefields, no clear territories. There were only zones, shifting with pressure gradients. Armies were not legions, but caravans, bands of armed engineers, cold keepers, and heat scribes, marching with instruments that measured not enemy strength, but environmental drift. One contemporary account, from the Concord of Emberfall, describes these wars vividly. We fought not men, but angles. A village might be safe at dawn and fatal by dusk. We claimed land not by conquering it, but by surviving it longer than others. The Twilight Wars were the first conflicts where climate was not a battlefield, but a combatant. To stabilize the chaos, leaders emerged, some noble, most not. From the sunward refugees rose the Burnished Legion, a stratocracy of heat-hardened warriors whose skin bore the cracked texture of ancient play. They believed survival in the day had marked them as chosen, and they fought with a fervor that terrified even their allies. From the frost cantons emerged the ice-bound orders, monastic militias trained in underground caverns guided by cold logic and ritual. They were less passionate than the Burnished, but more disciplined, as patient as glaciers, as merciless as frostbite. Between them rose the middle band's response, the Meridian Assemblies, coalitions of scholars, merchants, river wardens, and agricultural guilds. They valued diplomacy above force, but as Machiavelli once wrote, diplomacy without strength is merely prayer. Thus the belt drifted not only in geography, but in ideology. Heat gave birth to zealotry, cold birthed order, and twilight birthed compromise. The three were bound to collide. Yet for a moment, a brief glimmer in an otherwise grim chronicle, there was unity. It came during what historians call the Great Convergence, a rare period when atmospheric trenches stabilized for several decades, allowing the Twilight Belt to settle. Rivers flowed predictably, winds softened. The strip of habitable land widened by almost 50 kilometers. In that breathing space, societies built more than shelters, they built meaning. Cities rose, cautious but ambitious, carved into cliffs or suspended over ravines where hot and cold met. The greatest of them, Halion Station, stretched across what had once been the borders of France and Italy. It was a vertical metropolis of terraces, reflective plates, ice reservoirs, and hydraulic elevators, a city that clung to existence by architecture alone. There, for the first time since the stoppage, delegates from across the belt convened. They traded histories, technologies, myths. They attempted in fragile earnestness to write a shared record of humanity's fall and survival. They produced a document known as the Ledger of Balance, a philosophical treaty arguing that humanity must become a species of equilibrium, ever vigilant against extremes. It was the closest the Twilight Age ever came to harmony, and like all harmonies, it was temporary. For the convergence did not last. The atmospheric trenches shifted again, not as dramatically as before, but enough to tip the balance between the three great blocks. The Burnished Legion gained territory, the ice-bound orders lost several key valleys, and the Meridians, caught in between, were forced to choose alliances. And so the stage was set for the next era of the still world, not of migration, but of dominion. A new kind of empire was rising, forged not from ambition alone, but from the physics of a planet that no longer turned. Some rulers believed they could tame the twilight. Some believed they could reclaim the day. Some, the most dangerous, believed they could restart the world. Their dreams and the catastrophes that followed belonged to the next chapter of this history. The Great Convergence had been a mercy, but mercy is the rarest climate in human history. When the atmospheric trenches shifted again, subtly, unpredictably, the balance collapsed. The belt, once a fragile ribbon of cooperation, tore along its ideological seams. The twilight wars of survival became something far older, far more familiar, wars of dominion. And so began the age historians now call the empires of the unmoving sky, an era when humanity, unable to accept the stillness of the planet, attempted to force its own motion onto the world. Not through machines, not through industry, but through power, myth, and the ancient delusion that the strong can shape fate. The rise of the Dayward Dominion. The burnished legion had always believed the sun had chosen them. They carried its scars on their bodies, its glare in their minds, its cruelty in their hearts. When the trenches shifted slightly toward the night side and the marches expanded, they seized the moment with the fervor of messianic conquerors. Their leaders, men and women with sun-cracked skin and shimmering copper masks, proclaimed the founding of the Dayward Dominion, a theocracy forged from heat and survival. Their ideology was simple, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. To endure heat is to inherit the earth. In their chronicles, they rewrote the stoppage as a purge, a cosmic act of selection. The sun, they claimed, had burned away the weak and left the worthy to carry its flame. Children of the Dominion were raised beneath filtered skylights, trained from infancy to withstand blistering temperatures. Initiation rites involved standing in heat chambers until the skin blistered. Death was common, survival was proof of divine favor. In the Dominion, suffering was not tragedy. Suffering was curriculum. With their regained territory and their absolute unity, they became the first true superpower of the still world. Their armies, caravans of sun-hardened warriors, marched along the upper twilight, expanding into zones no one else dared to cross. They brought irrigation technology stolen from the meridians, thermal shields captured from the frost cantons, and a cult-like discipline that made their advance inevitable. The Dominion's ambition was nothing less than apocalyptic, to conquer the entire Terminator and force humanity to face the sun without fear. The Frost Mandate and the War of Depths. On the night side, the icebound orders suffered catastrophic losses during the drift. Glaciers overran several of their oldest citadels, entombing libraries, temples, and memory vaults under walls of blue-black ice. But the orders were not extinguished. They had spent generations preparing for loss. Unlike the Dominion, which worshipped endurance, the Cantons worshipped preservation. Ice to them was not death, it was archive. Everything frozen was sacred. And so, from the shattered remnants of the old Cantons, a new empire emerged. The Frost Mandate, a confederation of surviving orders led by the cold priests of the abyssal monastery. Their creed was as chilling as their homeland. Heat is impermanence. Ice is truth. Where the Dominion conquered with fire, the Mandate conquered with patience. They expanded not across the surface, but below it, through vast tunnels burrowed into the bedrock. These tunnels, cold arteries stretching for hundreds of kilometers, allowed them to bypass Dominion lines and strike deep into neutral Twilight territory. Mandate warriors wore armor of layered furs and frozen ceramic plates, They carried ice blades that shattered but cut with surgical precision. Their shields were thick slabs of compressed frost, reinforced with resin, used to blind enemies with sudden bursts of crystalline dust. Inhabitants of the middle band whispered a proverb: "You feel the Dominion coming. You hear the mandate coming. You never see the mandate leaving." To them, the Frozen Empire was not a nation, it was a phenomenon. The mandate's ultimate goal was not conquest of land, for frozen Earth had little value. Their goal was conquest of archives. They believed the belt had forgotten too much, that the future could only be secured by reclaiming all surviving knowledge from before the stoppage. Thus began the War of Depths, as mandate engineers tunneled beneath rival settlements to steal libraries, hard drives, engraving plates, seeds, anything that might preserve truth. To the mandate, history itself was territory. To the Dominion, this was heresy. Conflict became inevitable. The Meridian Collapse and the Scholar Kings. Caught between fire and frost, the Meridian assemblies struggled to maintain their fragile stability. Their strength had always been diplomacy, trade, technology, but none of these held power against religious zeal or monastic discipline. When both great empires expanded toward the middle band, the assemblies realized something awful. They were the prize. The best farmland, the widest rivers, the mildest temperatures all lay in Meridian territory. Soon the assemblies fractured under pressure. Some city-states allied with the Dominion, receiving heat-resistant crops in exchange for tribute. Others aligned with the Mandate, hoping its tunnels would protect them from solar raids. Within 2 generations, the assemblies ceased to exist as a unified entity. But in their ashes rose something stranger, more desperate, and ultimately more influential: the Scholar Kings. These were the remnants of Meridian intellectuals, astronomers, agriculturalists, archivists, who seized power not with armies, but with knowledge. In a still world where dawn never came, knowledge was power, the only variable left. The Scholar Kings founded city republics of study, fortified academies built around old observatories or pre-stoppage research labs. They accumulated scavenged data, deciphered ancestral languages, and carved treaties into metal plates buried deep underground. Their guiding belief was radical, that the stoppage was reversible. All that was needed, they claimed, was enough understanding of geophysics, of ancient technologies, of lost mathematics. Their cities, such as Lyrehold, Solen, and the Perforated Tower, became beacons of inquiry surrounded by walls of solar mirrors and ice reservoirs. Where the Dominion demanded loyalty and the Mandate demanded order, the Scholar Kings demanded curiosity. But curiosity, history has shown, is not a stable foundation for power. It breeds dissent, ambition, obsession. And obsession was precisely what brought the Twilight Belt to the brink of its next disaster. The dream of turning the world. It began as a whisper, then a hypothesis, then a cult. Among the Scholar Kings, a faction emerged that believed the stoppage was not random, that it had been triggered by a geological mechanism, perhaps magnetic or rotational, that might be restarted. They called themselves the Turners. Their scriptures, recovered from fragments of pre-stoppage physics texts, argued that if enough force could be applied in the right direction, through explosions, gravitational manipulation, or atmospheric distortion, the planet might shudder into rotation again. A terrible, beautiful idea, the kind that kills civilizations. Most scholars dismissed the Turners as dreamers or madmen, but the Dominion saw them as dangerous heretics who sought to undo the sun's judgment. The Mandate saw them as existential threats who would melt their sacred ice. And so, for the first time since the stoppage, fire and frost found a common enemy: those who wanted to restart time. The prelude to catastrophe. Tensions between the three powers intensified. Dominion legions marched toward Lyrehold, claiming to purify its forbidden experiments. Mandate tunnels began to surround Scholar King city-states like roots preparing to strangle a tree. The Scholar Kings fortified themselves and doubled their research, fearing the window to act was closing. The Twilight Belt entered an age of militarized science. Siege engines built from solar towers, mines carved with supercooled explosives, communication relays transmitting coded prayers for allies. Violence and brilliance intertwined. The world was a crucible of extinction and possibility. In the journals of a Lyrehold mathematician, I once read the line, "If we succeed, the world may live again. If we fail, at least it will be allowed to end in motion." This phase, this feverish decade of ambition and dread, was the hinge on which the entire Twilight civilization would turn. For the next chapter of this history would bring either rebirth or annihilation. The world had stopped spinning once. Now humanity stood on the edge of deciding whether it should ever move again. For centuries after the stoppage, humanity had lived as tenants on a dead planet, adapting, compromising, surviving in the narrow ribbon where life had not yet surrendered. But in the era of the empires, something changed. Survival was no longer enough. The Twilight Belt began to dream again, dangerously, magnificently, fatally. The Turners, once a fringe sect among the Scholar Kings, had become the gravitational center of the age. Their idea, to restart the rotation of the Earth, spread like a fever through the academies, through the trade halls, through the caravans. It whispered a blasphemous hope that humanity could reverse the apocalypse. But as with all hopes, it demanded a price. And history, like physics, always collects. The Turner Revolution. At first, the Turners spoke only in the language of theory, equations carved into stone tablets, diagrams etched on copper plates, lectures delivered in the high observatories of the middle band. But theory alone was no longer enough. The Dominion and the Mandate were closing in from both sides. Scholar King cities, with their libraries and experimental towers, became targets. Maps of the belt began to show Turner strongholds with ominous red or blue borders creeping toward them. Lyrehold fell first, not to siege engines, but to treachery. A faction of its own scholars defected to the Mandate, revealing tunnel routes and weak points. The fall of Lyrehold marked the true beginning of the Turner Revolution. Thousands fled, carrying scraps of research, half-burned manuscripts, and memory cubes encoded with ancient simulations. These refugees formed the First Rotational Congress, a strange parliament of mathematicians, engineers, refugees, and mystics. From their ranks came Turner theory's first definitive statement: if the world is trapped, we must push. If time is frozen, we must break it. But how does one move a planet? The three impossible solutions. Early Turner documents describe three proposed mechanisms, each more outrageous than the last. 1. The atmospheric engines. The simplest in theory, impossible in practice. Used giant towers to accelerate the atmosphere itself, creating drag that might tug the crust into rotation. The early simulations showed two fatal flaws. The towers would need to be hundreds of kilometers tall. The resulting winds would tear the belt apart. The Dominion, ironically, supported this plan enthusiastically, They believed even an incomplete attempt would scorch the middle band, eliminating their rivals. Their support killed the idea instantly. No scientist would allow their work to become a weapon of genocide. 2. The tectonic hammers, favored by mandate defectors. Detonate thermoseismic charges along fault lines, using the shock to twist the lithosphere. The problem: if it failed, the entire crust could shatter. If it succeeded, the day-night boundary would shift unpredictably, killing millions. The orders declared the idea geological sacrilege. Turner engineers, unwilling to risk a global earthquake, abandoned it. 3. The orbital flywheel. This proposal came from a half-forgotten pre-stoppage concept. Build a ring of mass in low orbit, a gigantic artificial belt, and spin it around the Earth. Then, using electromagnetic tethering, transfer momentum back into the planet. A planetary flywheel. It was poetic, elegant, insane, but unlike the other proposals, it was possible. The Turners committed themselves fully. The age of rising rings. For the first time since the stoppage, humanity turned its gaze upward, not towards the sun, a tyrant, but towards the sky, that vast, unmoving dome where orbit had become meaningless. The flywheel required resources the Twilight Belt had never attempted to gather: metals, superconductive fibers, solar-reflective alloys, launch rails, magnetic catapults, micro-reactors, even remnants of old satellites. The Twilight Belt became a quarry and a foundry. From the Dominion, the Turners bargained for desert metals, harvested from the glassified skeletons of sun-blasted cities. From the Mandate, they bartered for frozen rare earths buried under ancient glacial strata. From the Meridians, they took, or stole, what remained of old-world technology. A Turner chronicler wrote, "For the first time since rotation ceased, humanity gathered resources not to fight one another, but to fight oblivion." But unity was a myth. Every empire expected to control the flywheel once it was built. Every ruler imagined they could dictate who would live in the new dawn and who would burn in the new day. The flywheel became a race, a weapon, a prophecy. And high above the belt, the skeleton of a ring began to glow. The first launch and the first betrayal. The launch rails, titanic tracks of superconductive alloy, were built along the stable middle of the belt. They were powered by geothermal wells and wind collectors that seized the last remnants of atmospheric motion. At last, after decades of preparation, humanity attempted its first launch, a single segment of the orbital flywheel, no larger than a cargo ship. All three powers watched. The Dominion held its breath behind polarized visors. The Mandate muttered cold prayers. The Meridians wept openly. The segment rose. For the first time in centuries, something moved upward with intent. It climbed along the rail, glowing white, and shot towards the sky, a streak of molten light. For a moment, it seemed the Turner dream would be realized. The segment stabilized in orbit. Computers linked, thrusters aligned. The first piece of the ring shivered into place. And then someone fired. A beam of concentrated solar energy, a Dominion war weapon, lanced into the sky, striking the segment and shattering it into molten fragments. The Turners screamed. The Meridians collapsed. The world held its breath. The Dominion proclaimed, "Only those chosen by the sun may turn the earth." They had revealed their intent, not to stop the flywheel, but to steal it. The betrayal of the first launch triggered the greatest conflict in Twilight history. The Ring War. The Turner Revolution dissolved overnight. The flywheel became the object of the Ring War, a three-sided struggle waged in caverns, deserts, tunnels, and the sky. The Dominion launched solar zeppelins armed with heat beams, deploying them along the dayward arc. The Mandate tunneled beneath assembly yards, collapsing launch sites and freezing reactors. The Scholar Kings fragmented, some joining the Dominion as technocrats, others fleeing into the Mandate's tunnels, still others maintaining their independence through cunning diplomacy. Battles were strange, silent, and mathematical. Dominion skyclads slicing heat into Turner forges, ice-bound assassins emerging from the dark to steal reactor cores. Turner caravans carrying superconductive fibers through storms of radioactive twilight. Entire cities relocated overnight to escape shifting trenches. The war bent the belt like metal under strain. And yet, amid the chaos, the flywheel grew, piece by piece, segment by segment, sabotaged, rebuilt, shattered, repaired. Humanity was destroying itself and building its greatest creation at the same time. The discovery that changed everything. It happened during the 7th year of the Ring War. A team of Turner astronomers studying deep-sea magnetic fluctuations found something impossible. The Earth's core was moving, slowly, weakly, as if trying to turn. One astronomer etched the finding into ceramic. The Earth still dreams of rotating. The stoppage had not killed the planet's dynamo. It had only put it into a coma. A nudge of sufficient magnitude might restart it. But the required force was now far greater than before, because the planet had settled into a new equilibrium. The flywheel alone would not be enough. Something else was needed, something catastrophic, something final. The discovery divided the Turners into two camps: the restorationists, who believed the Earth could be revived gently; the catastrophists, who believed the planet must be shocked violently back into motion. The Dominion embraced the catastrophists. The Mandate embraced the restorationists. The Scholar Kings broke apart entirely. And the flywheel, nearly complete, hung above the belt like a guillotine waiting for its blade. The world on the eve of the final attempt. By the end of Part 5 of this story, the still Earth stands at a precipice. Above, the half-finished orbital flywheel gleams like a metallic halo. Below, 3 empires march toward annihilation. The Dominion prepares a solar superweapon that could ignite the atmosphere. The Mandate gathers cold detonators capable of fracturing continents. The Turners, fractured, desperate, brilliant, race to complete the ring. All believe they can restart the world. None understand what will happen if they try. For the first time since the stoppage, the planet is on the brink of motion again. A motion that could mean rebirth or extinction. In the decades leading to the final attempt, humanity lived inside a paradox. The world was utterly still, yet history moved with a speed and violence unseen even in the eras of empire and revolution. The flywheel neared completion. The 3 powers sharpened their ideologies into weapons. The Turner schism widened into a chasm. And the Twilight Belt, that fragile band between eternal fire and endless frost, braced for a future it could neither prevent nor fathom. This was the age historians call the hourglass of extinction, a time when every grain of sand seemed ready to fall at once. The final Turner schism. The original Turner movement had been founded on vision, bold, improbable, and slightly mad. But vision alone cannot endure the weight of generations. Ambition corrupts, faith petrifies, desperation mutates. By the time the flywheel reached 70% completion, the Turner assembly was no longer merely fractured, it was at war with itself. 2 factions crystallized. 1. The restorationists. Still clinging to the dream of gentle rotation, they sought to use the flywheel as a long-term stabilizer. Their approach was cautious, almost prayerful. Gradually spin the ring. Slowly transfer momentum. Adjust the Terminator line centimeter by centimeter. Avoid seismic devastation. They believed Earth should be returned to motion the way a comatose patient is awakened, carefully, slowly, with a doctor at the bedside. Their mantra was, "Do not break what you wish to heal." 2. The Cataclysmists, a fanatical offshoot who believed the world needed shock, not surgery. To them, the stoppage was a trauma that could only be undone with violence equal to its cause. They proposed a horrifying plan: detonate the Mandate's cold detonators and the Dominion's solar capacitors simultaneously, creating a shockwave that would twist the Earth into rotation and allow the flywheel to amplify it. To them, apocalypse was not something to fear. It was a tool, a cleansing, a rebirth through destruction. Their credo was chilling: if dawn must return in blood, let the blood be ours. Humanity had created factions that mirrored the extremes of the still world itself, one frozen in caution, one burning with zeal. The middle ground, as always, withered. The threefold arms race. The Ring War had transformed from a territorial conflict into something more biblical, a struggle over who would hold the match when the world was ready to burn. Each empire prepared its own decisive instruments. The Dominion, the Soul Throne. Deep in the deserts of the Dayward Edge, the Dominion built a massive orbital beam array, a cathedral of mirrors, lenses, and prisms, all focused on a single point of the heavens. This was the Soul Throne, an engine designed to concentrate sunlight into a column of annihilation. Its primary purpose was to vaporize enemy launch rails, cripple the flywheel, ignite atmospheric hydrogen if needed. Its priest declared it the finger of the sun, a holy instrument to choose who deserved the new dawn. In their vision, the Earth would turn, but only after their enemies had been reduced to glass. The Mandate, the cryo-corona. While the Dominion worshipped fire, the Mandate perfected cold. Beneath the frost cantones, in caverns older than civilization, Mandate monks forged a ring of cryogenic mines linked by superconductive veins. This was the cryo-corona, a chain of cold detonators capable of sending vibrations into the lithosphere, cracking the crust like an eggshell. Used carefully, it could nudge tectonic plates. Used hastily, it could split continents. The Mandate claimed it was a tool of preservation. If the world must move, let it move without flames. But everyone knew the truth. The cryo-corona was a sword frozen sharp enough to decapitate the flywheel and shatter the belt. As the two empires built weapons, the true turners built something stranger, a superstructure designed to regulate the flywheel's torque. The Helian spindle, rising from the center of the belt, was an impossible tower of magnetic counterweights, quantum gyroscopes, cryonic float chambers, atmospheric siphons, reconstructed pre-stoppage nuclear cores. The spindle was not a weapon. It was an anchor, the only device capable of directing the flywheel once it began to turn. But its existence made it a target for both empires. Without the spindle, the flywheel would spin blind, and the planet might tear itself apart. Thus, the most important object in human history became the world's most vulnerable: the collapse of the middle band. By the time the spindle reached its final tiers, the Twilight Belt had become unrecognizable. The middle band, once a fragile zone of commerce and compromise, degraded into an arena for proxy wars. Dominion militias raided Twilight farms, burning everything that could not be seized. Mandate saboteurs sunk ice tunnels beneath entire towns. Turner enclaves fortified themselves with mirrored fortresses and cryo-moats. The once peaceful caravan routes became rivers of refugees. The Ledger of Balance, that noble treaty crafted during the Convergence, was now nothing more than a relic prayed over by widows and orphans. A scribe in the city of Selene wrote, "The sky remains still, but humanity spins like a wheel without a center. The old world had stopped turning. The new world turned too fast." The last attempt at diplomacy. there was one final attempt to avoid catastrophe. Representatives from all factions convened in the Shaded Atrium, a cavernous chamber carved into a mountain at the exact midpoint between day and night, a place where no one felt fully at home and no one felt fully safe. The meeting lasted 5 days. It is known to history as the Failed Meridian Council. There were no agreements, only accusations. The Dominion demanded control of the spindle. The Mandate demanded dismantlement of the Flywheel. The Turner restorationists pleaded for rationality. The Turner cataclysmists declared rationality obsolete. The atrium itself recorded the final words spoken there, carved into its obsidian walls by a neutral artisan. We came to decide the world's fate. Instead, we discovered we had already chosen it. When the delegates departed, they no longer walked as diplomats, they walked as executioners. There would be no seventh meeting, only a final confrontation. The eve of reversal. As Part 6 ends, the world stands on the threshold of the last night of stillness. Above, the flywheel glimmers, nearly complete, spanning a third of the sky. Below, armies gather. Dominion zealots beneath the blazing horizon, Mandate monks emerging from the frozen dark, Turner scholars fortified around the spindle, cataclysmist cells preparing suicidal ignition sequences. The atmosphere hums with charged particles, the crust groans under accumulating stresses. Birds no longer live to flee, they fall where they stand. The stage is set not for a war, but for an irreversible act. For if the flywheel spins, the world may be reborn. If it shatters, the world may die noiselessly. And if neither side prevails, then humanity will remain forever trapped in the eternal twilight of its own making. The night before the end was not night at all, for night like day had lost its meaning. The sky above the Twilight Belt remained the same bruised orange-purple it had held for centuries, a wound of light and shadow that never healed. But the feeling was unmistakable. Across the belt, in fortified cities and frozen tunnels, in mirrored towers and burning deserts, humanity sensed it. The world was about to choose. Or rather, we were. For the first time since the stoppage, history itself trembled. The hourglass of extinction, long inverted, was down to its final grains. The trigger hour. Every Turner chronicle agrees on one fact. The final ignition was scheduled for the moment when the flywheel reached maximum structural tension, the point beyond which it would collapse under its own mass if not allowed to release energy. And that moment came suddenly, like a held breath breaking. Alarms pulsed through the Helian spindle. Gyroscopes screamed. Magnetic fields flickered. The flywheel, a halo of metal encircling the world, had reached its turning threshold. It could no longer wait. In the spindle command chamber, Turner restorationists scrambled to initiate the gentle rotational sequence. They believed they still had time to stabilize the process, to coax the Earth into motion. But the cataclysmists had beaten them there. A cold detonator was already armed, a solar capacitor already primed. The extremists had infiltrated the chamber with one goal only: force the planet to turn no matter the cost. The spindle guards rushed in. Mandate infiltrators emerged from beneath the floor, blades of ceramic glistening. Dominion zealots smashed through the skylights, masks blazing in reflected sunlight. The final battle of the still world began not on a field, but in a room no larger than a cathedral nave, a room whose walls hummed with the energy of a sleeping planet. It was not a grand strategy or heroic speech that determined the fate of the world. It was a mistake, a single accidental collision. A Mandate monk swung his frost blade at a Dominion zealot. The zealot raised his solar prism to block it. The blade struck the prism. Cold met heat, violently. The resulting discharge arced into the spindle's activation core. A bolt of impossible energy shot upward through the tower and into the flywheel above, sending a ripple through metal that stretched halfway around the Earth. And then, all at once, activation. The cryocorona detonated prematurely. The Soul Throne released its beam. The flywheel engaged. All three forces, cold, heat, momentum, surged into the planet simultaneously. It was the exact scenario every scientist had feared, the scenario the catastrophists had prayed for, the scenario the restorationists had fought to avoid. Three opposites collided, and the Earth shuddered. Since the stoppage, the planet's crust had been quiet, too quiet. No tectonic drift, no rotational stress, no seismic hum. But now a deep vibration roared from the core outward, like a sleeping beast stabbed awake. The sky flickered, the ground rippled, mountains bowed. The glaciers of the Mandate cracked like glass bowls struck by a hammer. Across the belt, people fell to their knees as the unmoving horizon shifted slightly, then more. A farmer in the middle band wrote later, "The dawn line moved like a blade unsheathed." For the first time in centuries, the sunbeam creeped. Dust drifted sideways. Shadows bent at new angles. A cup of water trembled, and the ripples moved east. The Earth was rotating. Barely, slowly, weakly, like a newborn taking its first breath. But it was motion, a miracle of physics, a nightmare of consequences. Every prophecy had been correct. Every prophecy had been wrong. The Earth moved, and the Twilight Belt fractured. Where the sun's edge advanced, deserts were vaporized instantly. Settlements vaporized into white ash. Where the night retreated, megaton blocks of ice shattered, triggering continental floods. Entire regions were thrust into climates they had not experienced in generations. A canyon that had lived in shadow for a century suddenly found itself under blazing light. A plateau warmed for generations froze solid within minutes. The atmospheric trenches, stable for decades, twisted into spirals of death. Superstorms formed around the new equator line, tearing into everything in their path. Millions died in the first hour, millions more in the second. The turning of the Earth, so long desired, was not gentle. It was a planetary scream. In the chaos, in the collapsing spindle, a handful of Turner engineers realized something horrifying. The flywheel was accelerating. Too fast, far too fast. If left unchecked, it would overshoot, spinning the Earth into a rotational velocity that would tear the crust apart. The only way to stop it was to break it. Someone needed to destroy the flywheel, from the inside. A decision with no survivors. Turner manuscripts record the moment with tragic simplicity. We built the ring, we now unmake it. A team of volunteers, restorationists, mandate monks, and even a few Dominion zealots who had abandoned their fanaticism boarded the launch catapult. Their mission was suicide, but it was also salvation. The last recorded transmission from the team is etched into the spindle's ruins. Let the world turn as it must. Let humanity find a way to follow. The catapult fired. The shuttle shot into the flywheel, and at the exact moment the Earth reached a survivable rotation, they detonated the ring. A white wound tore across the sky. Fragments rained like burning stars. The flywheel died. The Earth lived. The volunteers vanished. They are remembered as the martyrs of momentum. No empire claims them. All honor them. The planet did not return to its ancient speed. It rotated slowly, a day lasting weeks, a night lasting weeks more. The Terminator drifted in vast arcs, giving each region both warmth and shade across long seasons. The atmosphere stabilized, storms calmed. Oceans, though transformed, found new equilibrium. New rivers formed where glaciers melted. Vegetation awoke in places that had slept for centuries. The Twilight Belt widened into a habitable band thousands of kilometers long, a new cradle of civilization. Humanity had not restored the old world, it had created another. The Dominion collapsed first, unable to survive without an eternal sun. The Mandate followed soon after, their frozen citadels lost to the new seasons. The Scholar Kings disbanded, their mission fulfilled. The Turners dissolved, their cause completed in sacrifice. In their place rose new societies, shaped not by extremity, but by rhythm, by seasons, by change, by motion. A historian of the New Dawn wrote, "Our ancestors lived in stillness and became fanatics. We live in motion and become human again." But there is one final twist to this tale, one few speak of, yet all understand. The Earth rotates now not because physics decreed it, but because humanity, fractured, desperate, foolish, brilliant, demanded it. We forced time to move again. We gave the world its breath, and in doing so, we chained ourselves to a truth older than the sky. A world that stops can be started. A world that starts can be stopped. Our fate is never fixed. It is something we always risk breaking. And that is the final irony. Humanity survived the death of rotation only to discover that it was never the Earth that needed turning. It was us. End of the Twilight Chronicle.